Have you ever thought about what your pet is trying to say when they suddenly act weird? What if that way of acting could save lives? Danny Morrison, and his police horse, Storm, make an unusual pair. Together, they uncover a plot that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. The morning fog hung low over Hyde Park like a grey blanket, making the busy cityscape of London look softer. Danny Morrison shifted in the saddle as Storm, his chestnut police horse, moved gracefully along the bridle path. Danny still felt like he had to prove himself in the Metropolitan Police Mounted Unit when he was 26. His co-workers often joked that he talked to Storm more than he talked to people, and they were right. "Another beautiful morning in paradise, boy," Danny said softly as they got closer to the speaker's corner area and patted Storm's neck. Danny had learned that when Storm's ears flicked back toward his voice, it meant that Storm was listening but also looking around. "Mom called again last night to ask when I'm going to get a real job." A real job. Can you believe that? It's hard to believe that keeping London safe is not considered a real job. Storm snorted softly, and you could see his breath in the cool air. Danny smiled even though he was frustrated. His family in Birmingham still didn't understand why he chose to be a police officer instead of a computer programmer, which was what his degree had prepared him for. Danny's bank account reminded him every month when rent was due that the pay in tech was better. But there was something about this job and the partnership with Storm that made the money problems seem worth it. Danny said, "At least you understand me, right, Storm?" As he led the horse toward a group of tourists who were already taking selfies near the entrance to Hyde Park Corner in the early morning. "You never judge me for picking horses over hard drives." As they got closer, the tourists looked up with excitement. Danny was used to all the attention. A mounted police officer was still a new thing in modern London, and tourists loved the chance to take pictures. He smiled and nodded as people took pictures and raised their phones. A middle-aged woman with an American accent yelled, "Excuse me, officer. Can we take a picture of you and your pretty horse?" "Of course," Danny said, moving Storm into the best position. After all, his job was part of community policing. It was important to have positive relationships with the public, even tourists. Storm stood completely still, and you could see how strong he was in every muscle of his body. Danny was talking to the tourists and answering their questions about his work and Storm's training when he noticed that his horse was starting to act differently. Storm abruptly turned his relaxed, forward-facing ears back and then forward again. Danny's neck got tense, and he could feel the horse's weight shift slightly beneath him. A young man with a strong German accent asked, "How long have you been working with Storm?" He was still taking pictures with his phone. "About 2 years now," Danny said, but he was getting more and more worried about how frustrated Storm was getting. Danny knew that the horse was shifting its weight from hoof to hoof, which was a sign of barely contained anxiety. "He's a great partner." Danny saw the man in the grey coat at that point. He was about 30 feet away and partly hidden by a big oak tree. He wasn't looking at the mounted officer or the excited tourists, like the others walking by. Instead, he was looking at a small electronic device in his hands that looked like a smartphone but had a longer antenna. The man's fingers moved across the device's surface with the skill of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Storm's response got stronger. The horse's nostrils flared as he took deep breaths, and his ears were pinned back against his head, which was a clear sign that he was scared or upset. Danny had never seen his partner act this way around a group of tourists before. "Storm, easy boy," Danny whispered, keeping his voice calm so the tourists who were still around them wouldn't get scared. But every instinct he developed over the 2 years working with this horse told him to pay attention. The horse took 3 slow steps back, away from the tourists and the man with the device. Danny had learned to believe in Storm's gut feelings. The horse could read people and situations almost like a supernatural being. Storm had told Danny about everything from pickpockets to people with hidden weapons while they were training, but Danny had never been able to explain how the horse knew these things. The American woman asked the officer, "Is everything okay?" when she saw that the horse and rider had changed. Danny told her that everything was fine, but he was now paying more and more attention to the man in the grey coat. "We just need to keep going with our patrol." The man looked up from his device as if he knew Danny was watching. They looked at each other for a brief moment across the distance. The man's face was blank, but Danny's skin crawled when he looked at him. The man calmly put his device in his pocket and started to walk away at a measured pace, as if he would rather not draw attention to himself. Danny knew that when Storm whinnied softly, it meant the horse wanted to follow or look into something. But the man was already getting lost in the crowd of people who were out for their morning jogs and walks with their dogs. Danny whispered, "We'll see him again, won't we, boy?" As he patted Storm's neck, and the horse's tension slowly went away. "I have a feeling this isn't over." Danny kept thinking about the encounter as he and his partner continued their patrol. Danny was troubled by the man's device, Storm's strange reaction, and the fact that the stranger had been watching them without their knowledge. Danny took out his radio to call in the incident, but then he stopped. What would he say, exactly? Would he really say that his horse was scared of a man holding a phone? His sergeant would like that. Danny instead made a mental note of the time and place and decided to write down anything strange that happened. If Storm's instincts were right, which they usually were, what happened this morning was just the start of something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple photo shoot in Hyde Park. The fluorescent lights in Sergeant Williams's office buzzed at that annoying frequency that seemed to go right through Danny's head. He sat across from his boss and tried to explain what had happened in Hyde Park, but Storm's strange behavior kept playing in his head like a broken record. "Okay, Morrison, let me get this straight," Sergeant Williams said as he leaned back in his creaky chair, which probably came from the Thatcher administration. "Your horse got scared when it saw a tourist with a phone, and now you think we have a security threat." Danny moved around in his seat, which made him feel awful. It did sound completely crazy when Williams said it that way. "It wasn't just nervous behavior, Sergeant. Storm was reacting to that electronic device in a way I've never seen him react to a regular smartphone or camera." Williams rubbed his temples like a tired man who had been dealing with eager young officers for almost 20 years. "Morrison, I really do appreciate how dedicated you are. But horses can be scared by many things. Maybe the man wore a different cologne, or the device made a noise we couldn't hear, or maybe Storm just wasn't having a good day. It happens." "But Sergeant." "No buts." Williams held up his hand to stop Danny from arguing. "I'm not writing up a security alert just because a police horse was acting fidgety around a tourist. Do you have any idea how that would look going up the chain of command? Scotland Yard would think we were the biggest joke." Danny's face turned red with anger. He was afraid this would happen. The Metropolitan Police was an organization that relied on rules, proof, and common sense. There was no box to check that said, "Horse had bad feelings about suspicious man." "I get your point, Sergeant, but what if I'm right? What if Storm saw something we didn't?" Williams sighed and took out a stack of papers that looked like they would be as boring as watching paint dry. "Then I suggest you do some real police work and find some real proof to back up your theory. Until then, this conversation is over." Danny left the office with a sinking feeling. He walked through the station's hallways, passing officers who were typing reports and answering phones, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing something important. Storm had attempted to explain this to them. That night, Danny was in the Metropolitan Police Mounted Unit, headquarters basement archives, where there were dusty file cabinets and boxes that smelled like old leather and history that had been forgotten. If no one else was going to take Storm's behavior seriously, he would have to figure it out on his own. There wasn't much information in Storm's official records. In 2019, the British Army gave the horse to the Metropolitan Police. However, most of the information about his time in the military was classified or had been blacked out with a thick black marker. Danny was able to figure out that Storm had been in a special unit that worked closely with military police in high-security situations. Danny finally found what he was looking for in a cross-referenced file that had been misfiled under equipment transfers instead of personnel records. It was almost midnight. The name Thomas Hayes was written in neat handwriting across the top of a training report that was dated 3 months before Storm's transfer to civilian police work. Danny's hands shook as he read the report. Thomas Hayes, who was 29 years old, had been Storm's trainer and handler in the Army. The paperwork says that Hayes came up with a new training program that taught horses how to spot electronic surveillance equipment and strange behavior in crowds. Many believed the program was highly innovative and had the potential to revolutionize security operations. The last thing in Hayes's file hit Danny like a punch to the chest. In November 2019, Thomas Hayes was killed in the London Bridge attack while off duty, trying to help civilians get away from the terrorist attack. He died a hero, but his new ways of training died with him. Because no one else knew how to carry on with his specialized program, all of his horses, including Storm, had been moved to regular police duty. Danny leaned back in his chair and stared at the file in his hands as the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. Storm wasn't just acting weird or having a bad day. The horse had been trained to find the exact kinds of threats that Danny had seen in Hyde Park. Thomas Hayes had taught Storm how to spot electronic surveillance devices, read crowd behavior, and tell when someone was watching and gathering information. The civilian police force didn't understand what Storm was trying to say, even though Thomas Hayes had taught him how to do his job. "Boy, you've been trying to tell me all along, haven't you?" Danny said softly to the empty archive room. "Thomas taught you how to find the bad guys, and I've been too stupid to listen." Danny read everything he could find about Thomas Hayes's training methods for the rest of the night. The reports talked about methods that sounded like they came from a science fiction book. Horses trained to find hidden recording devices by their electromagnetic signatures. Animals that could tell if someone was watching them by noticing small changes in how they stood and moved. Ways to teach horses to warn their riders of dangers that people might not be able to see or hear. Danny had already made 2 important choices by the time the sun came up over London. First, he was going to learn everything he could about how Thomas Hayes trained people and use that knowledge to work with Storm. Second, he was going to start paying attention to Storm's warnings, even if that meant looking into possible threats on his own time. Danny started to see patterns that he hadn't seen before over the next few days. Storm would get tense and alert in certain parts of London, always in places where there were a lot of tourists and clear lines of sight to important government buildings or royal sites. The area around Buckingham Palace, Westminster Bridge, Hyde Park, and the ceremonial routes used for state events. Whenever Storm said something was wrong, Danny would casually look around the area later. He would find signs of strange behavior most of the time. A tourist asking too many detailed questions about how security works. Someone taking pictures of places that didn't seem like they would be interesting to tourists. People who had electronic devices that looked more advanced than regular cameras or phones. Danny began keeping a detailed record of these events, marking them on a big street map of London that he had pinned to the wall of his small apartment. Red pins showed places where Storm had warned of possible threats. Danny had seen strange activity during follow-up investigations, and blue pins showed that it was real. There was no doubt about the pattern by the end of the week. Someone was keeping an eye on London's most important government and ceremonial sites in a planned way. Someone who knew exactly how to fit in with tourists and get information without drawing attention to themselves. Someone who didn't expect a specially trained police horse and his increasingly determined handler to see what everyone else had missed. Danny looked at his map late one night, tracing the lines between the different places where things had happened with his finger. There was one thing that all of the sites had in common. They were on or near the route used for trooping the colour, a big military ceremony that happens every year to honour the Queen's official birthday. It was only 2 weeks until the ceremony was supposed to happen. Danny said softly to the picture of Storm's old handler that he had found in the archive files, "Thomas, I think I'm finally starting to get what you taught him. And I think we might not have much time left." The day after Danny found out about Thomas Hayes and Storm's special training, the horse was more upset than ever. Storm's head kept turning toward the northeast as they started their patrol through central London. His ears kept swiveling in that direction like radar dishes looking for a signal. Danny had learned how to read these small signs, and Storm's body language was making it clear that something important was going on in that part of the city. "What is it, boy?" Danny whispered, letting Storm follow his instincts. "What are you seeing that I can't?" They walked through the slowly waking streets of London, past people rushing to tube stations and the occasional jogger making their way through the city. Storm's speed picked up with each block they passed. His strong muscles bunched, and released with barely contained energy. Danny could feel the horse's heart beating faster under the saddle, and his own heart started to beat in time with Storm's. When they got there, Camden Market was just starting to come to life. The famous market that used to be the centre of London's alternative culture scene was now a busy tourist spot with vendors selling everything from vintage band t-shirts to handmade jewellery. Even though it was still early in the morning, groups of people were already wandering through the maze of stalls and converted railway arches that housed hundreds of small businesses. Storm stopped suddenly near the entrance to the main market area, his body tensing up like a spring. Danny could see the white around the horse's eyes, which was a sure sign of extreme alertness or fear. His nostrils flared as he tested the air. This was the same thing Storm did in Hyde Park, but it was 10 times worse. Danny whispered, "Easy, Storm," as he looked around the crowd for any sign of what had set off his partner. "Let me see what you're seeing." Danny saw the Wi-Fi hotspot that shouldn't have been there at that point. A small table with what looked like a regular tourist information display was hidden between a booth selling vintage clothes and one selling handmade soaps. There was a hand-painted sign on the wall that said free Wi-Fi for visitors in several languages. On the table was a sleek black device that was about the size of a laptop and had a lot of small LED lights that blinked in complicated patterns. There was a young man with dirty blonde hair and expensive-looking headphones around his neck sitting behind the table. He looked at a tablet computer every now and then while reading a paperback book. Danny's background in computer science, on the other hand, told him that the device was much more advanced than a simple Wi-Fi router. The antenna setup was wrong, the LED pattern was too complicated, and the way the operator's fingers moved across the tablet's surface made it look like he was actively monitoring and changing data instead of just giving people internet access. Storm took 3 deliberate steps toward the strange setup, and Danny felt the horse's muscles tense up, as if it was getting ready to charge. The operator looked up from his book and met Danny's eyes for a moment before looking at Storm. The man's face went from bored to very interested in a matter of seconds, and Danny saw him reach for something under the table. "Police," Danny yelled, pushing Storm to move forward. "I need to talk to you." The young man's answer was quick and revealing. Instead of the confused compliance of an innocent tourist volunteer, he slammed his hand down on the tablet's screen, grabbed a small backpack from under the table, and ran into the busy market. The advanced device was left behind, still flashing its complicated pattern of lights. Danny yelled again, "Stop! Police!" But the suspect was already getting lost in the maze of market stalls. Storm didn't need any help. The horse lunged forward with the explosive power that made him useful in the military. His hooves struck sparks from the pavement as he sped up. Danny leaned low in the saddle, trusting Storm's instincts and training to get them through the rough terrain ahead. The chase that followed was unlike anything Danny had ever seen in his 2 years with the mounted unit. Storm seemed to know where the fleeing suspect would go next, cutting through gaps between stalls that looked too small for a horse and rider to fit through. As they thundered by, vendors dove out of the way, their screams of fear mixing with the sound of Storm's hooves hitting the uneven market floor. The suspect was quick and obviously knew Camden Market well, but he hadn't planned on chasing a horse that seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to follow him. Storm would change his course every time the man tried to lose them by ducking behind a stall or suddenly changing direction, as if he could tell where the man was going. Danny's radio was full of frantic calls from dispatchers. Witnesses all over the market reported a chase by mounted police. He tried to respond, between the jarring impacts of Storm's gallop, calling out their location and asking for help, but it was hard to stay in his seat. They ran out of the covered market area, and into the open space near Camden Lock, where the morning canal boat tours were just starting to load people. The suspect ran toward the water, probably hoping to lose them in the maze of narrow boats and footpaths that lined the canal. But Storm didn't give up. His military training showed in the way he kept going after them, even though the situation was hard and new. At that point, the suspect made a big mistake. The man didn't see the loose mooring rope that was stretched across the towpath at ankle height because he was looking back over his shoulder to see how far away his pursuers were. His feet got stuck in the thick nautical line, and he fell hard on the concrete path. His backpack flew open, and its contents spread out on the ground. Storm came to a stop just a few feet from the fallen suspect. His sides were heaving from the effort, but his eyes were still on the man who had set off his protective instincts. Danny got off his horse quickly, his heart racing from the excitement of the chase. "Stay down," Danny yelled as he got closer to the suspect with his hand on his radio. "You're under arrest for running away from a police officer and being suspected of illegal surveillance." Danny thought the man on the ground was older than he really was. He was probably in his early 20s and had a pale complexion that made it look like he spent most of his time inside staring at computer screens. His backpack had spilled out a lot of electronic gear, such as what looked like signal interceptors, encrypted communication devices, and a bunch of smartphones with different carrier services. The suspect said right away, "I want a lawyer." His accent made it clear that he was American, even though he worked in London. "I'm not saying anything without a lawyer." Danny was putting away the scattered equipment when he heard the distinct sound of several smartphone cameras taking pictures and recording video. A group of tourists and market vendors had gathered at a respectful distance, filming every moment of the arrest with the kind of excitement that only viral social media posts can bring. He heard one tourist say to another, "This is amazing. A police horse chasing a suspect through Camden Market. This is going right on Instagram." Danny's stomach dropped when he thought about what that meant. Within hours, if not minutes, videos of their chase would be all over the internet. The same publicity that could help the mounted unit get more support from the public could also let anyone else involved in the surveillance operation know that their network had been hacked. Danny was looking at the advanced Wi-Fi device they had left behind at the market stall as backup officers arrived to process the arrest and collect the evidence. Storm had noticed something about that equipment that had set off his special training. It was something that made him think it was being used for more than just giving tourists free internet. "Good boy, Storm," Danny whispered as he stroked the horse's neck, which was damp with sweat. Crime scene technicians started to list the suspect's equipment. Thomas would be proud of you. You just caught a really bad guy. Danny was happy that he had made a successful arrest, but a nagging worry kept coming back to him. If this young man was just one part of a bigger group and Storm's gut feeling about the threat they were facing was right, then their very public chase through Camden Market had just let everyone else in London know that the police were onto them. Danny felt uneasy as the clock ticked down. It seemed like they had just forced their unknown enemies to speed up whatever plan they had been following. Storm snorted softly and nudged Danny's shoulder with his muzzle, as if he could tell that his partner was getting more and more worried about what they had started. As they say, the game was on. The holding cell at Camden Police Station smelled like broken dreams and disinfectant. But what really scared Danny was the electronic equipment all over the evidence table. The young American suspect, who had finally revealed his name as Trevor Collins, sat hunched over in the corner of his cell, still refusing to talk without a lawyer present. But the devices he had on him told a story that was much worse than anything Danny had thought of. Sarah Mitchell, the chief inspector, stood next to Danny and looked over the high-tech surveillance gear that had been taken out of Trevor's backpack. Mitchell had seen enough real security threats by the time she was 45 to know what they were when they were laid out in front of her like pieces of a deadly puzzle. "This isn't tourist photography gear," Mitchell said as he picked up a device that looked like a modified smartphone but had a lot of extra antennas and ports. "This is military-grade signal interception hardware. It could listen in on police communications, follow government vehicles, and map out security protocols in real time." As the meaning of what he said sank in, Danny's chest tightened. So Storm was right. This is really a coordinated effort to watch people. Mitchell said, "Your horse found something that our own security sweeps missed." Her voice was a mix of admiration and worry that made Danny feel both right and scared. "Now we need to know if this Collins kid is acting alone or if he's part of a bigger group." 3 hours later, Mitchell's phone rang with a call that changed everything they thought they knew about the threat they were facing. Danny saw his boss's face get more and more pale as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. She would occasionally ask sharp questions that showed how big the problem was. Mitchell said, "That was MI5, and her voice was tight with the kind of controlled tension Danny had learned meant serious trouble. "Trevor Collins isn't just a random American tourist with expensive toys. He used to work for the NSA, but he disappeared from his job in Washington 6 months ago while being investigated for selling secret spying methods to private clients." Danny's background in computer science helped him understand the technical side of things, but the human side of things made him sick to his stomach. He's been teaching people how to use government-level surveillance tools for private purposes. But who is paying him, and what do they plan to do with all the information they've been gathering? Within an hour, MI5 sent a thick manila folder to Camden Station with the answer to that question. The picture on the front of the file was of a man in his early 50s with grey hair and hard eyes, which Danny had learned to recognize as a sign of someone who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. Marcus Webb's name was written under the picture, and his biography read like a warning about what could happen when patriotism turned into something darker and more dangerous. Marcus Webb had worked for MI5 for 15 years and had done a great job. He had worked his way up to become a senior analyst who focused on threats to the royal family and government institutions. His record was great until 2018, when he was quietly pushed into early retirement after a psychological evaluation showed what his bosses diplomatically called ideological concerns incompatible with continued service. "What kind of ideological concerns?" Danny asked as he read through Webb's file. Storm was waiting patiently in the station's temporary stable. Mitchell's face was serious as she looked at more papers. Former co-workers say that Webb became more and more convinced that the royal family was an outdated institution that was keeping Britain from making real democratic progress. He began to say that the monarchy should be ended, not through politics, but through public humiliation that would make it impossible for them to stay in power. The psychological profile showed that he was a smart but angry man who had spent years protecting people he hated. Webb was uniquely dangerous in ways that traditional security assessments had not seen coming. He was an expert in royal security protocols, had inside knowledge of police procedures, and was becoming more and more angry at the institution he had once served. "He knows exactly how we think, how we plan, and how we respond to threats," Mitchell said, her voice heavy with the weight of someone who was starting to understand the full extent of what they were up against. "He's not going to hurt the royal family physically. He's going to do something much more complicated that could be worse for the monarchy's long-term survival." Danny's hands shook a little as he read Webb's operational theory, which MI5 had found on his personal computer while searching his London apartment. Webb thought that the British public's support for the monarchy was mostly based on respect and tradition. These feelings could be systematically weakened by a well-planned campaign of public shame and perceived incompetence. Webb's plan, which he kept secret in encrypted files, was shockingly simple in terms of how smart it was. He had hired a group of people to spy on the upcoming Trooping the Colour ceremony. Many of them were disillusioned former government workers like him. Their goal wasn't to kill anyone or directly attack anyone. Instead, they wanted to plan a series of carefully timed accidents and mishaps that would make the royal family look foolish, out of touch, and unable to even do basic ceremonial duties. Audio disruption devices to scare the horses during the parade, Danny read aloud from Webb's operational notes. His voice got more and more worried with each detail. Signal jammers to mess with police communications. Social media manipulation to make any embarrassing moments go viral and make the monarchy look stupid. Mitchell shook his head sadly. He's not trying to use violence to bring down the government. Instead, he's trying to ruin the royal family's public image so badly that they'll have to step down out of shame. It's psychological warfare done through social media and public relations. The most terrifying part of Webb's plan was that it depended on the same technology and social dynamics that make up modern life. He had figured out how viral content could change people's minds, how social media could make embarrassing moments worse and use them as weapons, and how the 24-hour news cycle could make small events into huge scandals that everyone talked about for weeks or months. Danny felt sick as he read Webb's report on how past royal scandals had affected public opinion polling. The man had looked at every awkward moment, every time a member of the royal family broke the rules, and every time they acted like a normal person instead of a royal. He had come up with a scientific way to make and amplify these moments for the greatest psychological effect. Danny thought to himself, the Trooping the Colour ceremony is perfect for his needs. Maximum public visibility, live television coverage, international media attention, and dozens of chances for things to go wrong in ways that would make the royal family look incompetent or out of touch. Mitchell's phone buzzed again with a call from MI5, and Danny saw her face get even more serious as she listened to the latest news. She looked like someone who had just heard even worse news than what they had already found when she hung up. "Webb's network is bigger than we thought at first," she said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "MI5 has found at least 12 agents along the ceremonial route, all of whom have devices like the ones your horse found in Hyde Park and Camden Market. They're going to turn on their devices during the ceremony, which will cause a chain reaction of technological problems and embarrassing events that will be caught on camera and broadcast live to millions of people around the world." Danny's heart sank when he saw the time on the station wall. Webb's operatives had been planning this operation for months, and the Trooping the Colour ceremony was set to start in less than 18 hours. There was no way to be sure that they could find and stop all of the threats before the ceremony started, even though Trevor Collins was in jail and Marcus Webb's apartment was being watched. "What about Storm?" Danny asked. He suddenly understood why his partner had been so upset for the past few days. He's been aware of Webb's surveillance network all along. Thomas Hayes trained him to find this kind of electronic threat. Mitchell looked at Danny with the calculating look of someone who was weighing desperate options against impossible odds. How sure are you that your horse can find these devices during a ceremony with thousands of people? Danny thought about Storm's behavior during their patrols, how the horse had always been able to spot threats that people had missed, and how the horse had been trained by a fallen hero, who had known how important it was to be ready for this kind of thing. He thought about Thomas Hayes, who had died trying to protect people who were not guilty, and the duty that had been passed down to Storm and now to him. "Storm won't let us down," Danny said with a confidence that even he was surprised by. "He's been trying to warn us about this threat for days. If anyone can help us stop Webb's network, it's him." The next 18 hours would show if a computer programmer turned police officer and a specially trained horse could stop a carefully planned attack on one of Britain's most important institutions. The lines were drawn, and the future of the monarchy itself might depend on whether Danny and Storm could trust each other enough to do what traditional security measures had failed to do. The day of the Trooping the Colour ceremony started off with the kind of perfect British weather that seemed too good to be true. The clear blue skies over London looked like a painted backdrop, and the early June sun made everything look golden, which would make for great TV coverage. But as Danny Morrison got ready for what could be their most important patrol ever, the nice weather felt more like an ominous calm before a storm. Danny had never seen Storm so upset before. The horse's breathing, which was usually steady, came in short, quick bursts, and his ears moved around like radar dishes trying to pick up multiple signals at once. Danny could feel the animal's anxiety flowing through the reins and saddle like electricity. Every muscle in Storm's strong body was tense with barely contained energy. Danny whispered, "I know, boy," as he ran his hand along Storm's neck, and they took their place along the ceremonial route near Horse Guards Parade. "You're taking everything, aren't you? All of Webb's gadgets, all of his people, and all the threats that no one else can see." Even though it was early, people were already gathering. Tourists and royal fans were claiming the best spots to watch along the Mall and around Buckingham Palace. The mood was happy and festive, just the kind of good energy that Marcus Webb's network was going to use to hurt the monarchy in a psychological attack. Danny's radio was full of routine messages from other officers stationed in central London, but he could hear the subtle tension in their voices beneath the professional chatter. Word of the possible threat had spread among the officers, but most of them still didn't fully understand what they were up against. The official briefing had mostly been about normal security issues like pickpockets, protesters, and other crowd control problems that come up at big public events. Danny and Chief Inspector Mitchell were the only ones who really understood that they were dealing with something much more complicated and dangerous than normal threats. Webb's group wasn't going to hurt anyone physically, which made it almost impossible to find them using normal security measures. They wanted to make the royal family look bad and humiliate them in ways that would be caught on TV and spread on social media, until the monarchy's reputation was ruined beyond repair. "Are you in position, Danny?" Mitchell's voice came through the radio with the kind of controlled tension that meant she was handling more than one crisis at a time. Danny said, "Storm and I are ready." He looked around at the crowd for any sign of the operatives they knew were hiding among the thousands of people watching. "He's picking up on a lot of signals, but with so many people and so much real electronic equipment around us, it's hard to figure out what the real threats are." That was the worst part of Webb's plan. The ex-MI5 officer had planned his operation so that it would fit in perfectly with the usual electronic chaos of a big public event. There were thousands of smartphones, TV cameras, radio communications, and real security equipment making electromagnetic noise in the background. This made it almost impossible to figure out which devices were dangerous to the ceremony. Storm's training, on the other hand, went beyond just finding electronics. Thomas Hayes had taught the horse how to tell when someone was watching them in a hostile way by looking at their behavior and mental state. As the morning went on, Danny started to trust his partner's instincts more than any of the high-tech security systems around them. Danny whispered, "There," pointing to a middle-aged woman with a professional camera, who was standing near the barrier that separated the spectators from the ceremonial route. "She's not taking pictures like the other tourists. She's figuring out the best angles and timing her movements so the security cameras don't see her." Storm had seen at least a dozen operatives, including the woman, through small changes in his posture and attention. Each one was placed in a way that would make the disruption they were planning to cause have the biggest effect. Danny had tried to radio their locations to other officers, but without solid proof of wrongdoing, there wasn't much that regular security measures could do. The sound of military bands warming up in the distance told everyone that the ceremony was about to start. Soon, members of the royal family would start their procession from Buckingham Palace to Horse Guards Parade. After that, there would be the elaborate pageantry of the trooping the color itself. It was the kind of big, formal event that Webb's network had been getting ready for months to attack with technology. Danny's phone buzzed with a text that made him feel sick. The message was clearly meant for him, even though the number was blocked. "Your horse won't save you today. Some traditions deserve to die." MW not only was Marcus Webb keeping an eye on their conversations, but he was also making fun of them, sure that his plan was too complicated and well coordinated for Danny and Storm to stop. The ex-MI5 officer knew exactly how police operations worked, and he had set up his network to take advantage of every flaw in their response plans. "Mitchell, are you seeing this?" Danny said into his radio, trying to keep his voice steady as he sent Webb's message to his boss. "Received," Mitchell said, her voice tight with anger and frustration. "Don't let him get inside your head, Danny. Listen to what Storm is saying." It was easier to say than to follow that advice. As more people arrived and more electronic devices came online in the crowd, Storm's anger grew stronger by the minute. The horse was sensing so many possible dangers that Danny was starting to feel like they were facing too much. At exactly 11:15, the first members of the royal family came out of Buckingham Palace. The crowds that had gathered cheered loudly when they saw them. As the procession made its way to Horse Guards Parade, television cameras caught every moment. They didn't know that they were also recording the first moments of what could be a carefully planned campaign to ruin the monarchy's public image. Danny led Storm closer to the parade route, trusting the horse's instincts to find the most immediate threats among Webb's network of agents. Storm's ears perked up when he heard something in the crowd near St. James's Park, and Danny felt the horse's muscles tense up as they found their first target. The man looked like a typical tourist, with a guidebook and a camera bag, but he was in the wrong place. He wasn't paying attention to the royal procession that was coming up. Instead, he was staring at a small device in his hand with his thumb hovering over what looked like a button to turn it on. "That's one of them," Danny said into his radio, but as he spoke, he realized that Webb had seen this coming. The operative was in a part of the crowd that mounted police couldn't get to without causing the kind of chaos and disruption that Webb wanted. Storm chose for both of them. The horse suddenly stood up on its hind legs, and its strong body made a stunning display that caught the attention of every camera in the area right away. At first, Danny thought his partner was scared by all the sights and sounds of the ceremony, but then he realized what Storm was really doing. The horse standing up was a great distraction that let Danny see the operative's device and the exact frequency it was sending on. More importantly, Storm's dramatic actions set off an automatic security response that brought other officers to their location, creating the kind of coordinated police presence that Webb's plan had been meant to avoid. "He's turning something on," Danny yelled into his radio as Storm got back on all fours. "Activate the device near the entrance to the park." The target is a man in his 30s wearing a blue jacket and a black baseball cap. What happened next happened with the kind of accuracy that only comes from months of careful planning on both sides. Webb's operative knew he had been compromised and started to move through the crowd toward his backup position. However, Storm was already following him with the focused intensity of a predator stalking prey. The electronic device in the man's hand started making a high-pitched whine that was hard for people to hear but clearly upset the horses in the royal procession. Some of the ceremonial mounts started to act up, and their riders had a hard time keeping them under control as the animals reacted to the invisible electronic attack on their nervous systems. Danny could feel Storm's anger rising beneath him like a storm that was about to break. The horse probably understood better than any person that someone was using technology to hurt and scare other horses for selfish and cruel reasons. Storm's military training had taught him how to protect himself, and now all of his instincts were focused on stopping the source of the electronic harassment. "Easy, Storm," Danny whispered, but he was already letting go of the reins and getting ready to trust his partner's judgment completely. "Show me what Thomas taught you. Show me how to stop them." The next few minutes would show if their unusual partnership could stop a smart attack that regular security measures had failed to find or stop. Danny and Storm were about to face Marcus Webb's network with nothing but their trust in each other and their promise to protect something bigger than themselves. The future of the British monarchy, and maybe even the nature of democratic institutions in the digital age were at stake. The storm that had been building all morning was finally about to break. Only time would tell if the bond between one determined police officer and his amazing horse would be strong enough to get through what was coming. Danny Morrison would remember the strange things that happened after the Trooping the Colour ceremony for years to come. Danny stood in the quiet stable behind Westminster Police Station as the last of Marcus Webb's men were led away in handcuffs. The electronic devices that had threatened to embarrass the royal family were collected as evidence. Danny brushed Storm's coat with slow, methodical strokes that helped calm both of their nerves after the most stressful day of their partnership. It took hours for the official debriefings to finish. MI5 agents, high-ranking officers from the Metropolitan Police, and even people from the palace wanted to know how a young police officer and his horse were able to find and stop a complicated psychological warfare operation that had been able to get around Britain's most advanced security systems for months. Danny had tried to explain Storm's specialized training, Thomas Hayes's new methods, and the small behavioral cues that showed electronic surveillance equipment and hostile intent, but he could tell by the looks on their faces that most of the officials still didn't really get what had happened. "They keep asking me how I knew," Danny said quietly to Storm, brushing the horse's strong shoulder muscles. "How did I know to trust you when everyone else thought I was seeing threats that weren't there? How did I know that your instincts were better than their computers, cameras, and other high-tech monitoring systems?" Storm turned his head toward Danny and let out a soft breath through his nose. The young officer knew that this meant his partner was listening and understood more than most people would ever give him credit for. The horse's dark eyes showed that it was smart in a way that went beyond just being an animal. Thomas Hayes had seen and encouraged this kind of understanding in the horse when they were both in the military. The truth was that Danny was still trying to figure it out. In a time when people were bombarded with too much information, social media algorithms gave people exactly what they wanted to hear, and AI could make believable lies faster than people could check the facts. How did anyone learn to tell the difference between real threats and fake ones? How did anyone get the kind of gut feeling that could see through digital lies and find real danger? Before going in, Chief Inspector Mitchell knocked softly on the stable door. Her face showed how tired she was from dealing with a crisis that could have changed British history. Danny thought the manila folder she was carrying held more papers about their unusual success in stopping Webb's psychological attack on the monarchy. She also had 2 cups of tea. Mitchell handed Danny one of the steaming cups and said, "The Prime Minister wants to see you. There's talk of awards, possible promotions, and maybe even adding more horses trained in Thomas Hayes's methods to the mounted unit. Danny gratefully took the tea, but he couldn't stop looking at Storm. The horse was now standing perfectly still, as if he were thinking about what had happened that day with the same intensity that people use for deep thought. "Hey, kid, are you ready to be famous?" Mitchell smiled at how the horse and rider got along, but her face quickly became serious again. "Danny, what you and Storm did today was more than just stop Webb's network. You showed something important about how technology and intuition, as well as artificial intelligence and natural awareness, work together." "What do you mean?" Danny asked, even though he thought he already knew what this conversation was going to be about. Webb's whole plan was based on the idea that modern security systems could be tricked by advanced electronic deception. He thought that our cameras, monitoring software, and algorithmic threat assessment programs would miss the small behavioral patterns and psychological cues that showed hostile intent. He was right about the technology, but he didn't think about the fact that a horse trained by Thomas Hayes would be able to see things that our most advanced systems couldn't. Danny nodded slowly, getting what Mitchell was saying on a bigger level. Marcus Webb was a brilliant analyst, who knew how to take advantage of the flaws in digital security systems. However, he didn't realize how powerful true partnership between species could be. This kind of cooperation went beyond AI and tapped into forms of awareness that had been around for millions of years. Danny realized that Storm wasn't just finding electronic devices. This was something he had been thinking about all day. He was reading the intentions and mental states of the people who were using those devices. Thomas Hayes taught him how to spot the behavioral patterns of people who want to hurt others, no matter how well they might be hiding it or how advanced their technology might be. Mitchell's eyes lit up with the thrill of someone who was starting to understand how revolutionary what they had seen was. Exactly. We need ways to find the truth that go beyond technology in a world where deepfake videos can make anyone look like they're saying anything, social media bots can make fake outrage, and digital manipulation can turn fiction into what looks like fact. Storm's soft whinny broke up the conversation, and both people turned to look at the horse, who was standing up straight and alert. Danny looked out the stable window, where the setting sun was casting long shadows across the courtyard. The sounds of London's evening traffic made a constant urban symphony in the distance that had become the soundtrack of their daily patrols. "He's thinking about Thomas, isn't he?" Mitchell asked quietly, noticing that Storm was acting the same way that Danny had noticed. Danny stroked Storm's neck with the gentle touch that had become their main way of talking to each other. "I think so," he said. "Thomas Hayes knew something that we are just starting to learn. He knew that the most advanced threats of the 21st century wouldn't come from bombs or bullets, but from psychological manipulation and digital deception meant to make people hate each other." Both people felt the weight of that realization like a heavy blanket. Webb's group didn't want to kill anyone, but their psychological warfare campaign could have hurt British society in a way that was even worse. They could have sped up the kind of social breakdown that was already happening in communities across the Western world by humiliating the royal family, and making people less trusting of democratic institutions. Danny's voice got stronger as he thought about what Storm had found today. What Storm found wasn't just electronic equipment, he said. He could tell that the equipment was meant to be used for bad things, the feelings and mental states of people that no algorithm can accurately measure or predict. Mitchell took out her phone and showed Danny a list of news headlines that had already started to show up on major media sites. "The story is spreading faster than we thought. Police horse prevents royal humiliation. Animal instinct beats high-tech surveillance, and the mounted officer who saved the monarchy." Danny didn't like the exaggerated language, but he got the bigger picture that was resonating with people all over the world. In a time when technology was getting more complicated and social media was being used to manipulate people, It was comforting to read a story that praised the strength of real partnerships, natural intuition, and the trust that grew between people who really understood each other. Mitchell said as he read through the comments and social media responses to the day's events, "People are hungry for real connections. People are sick of being controlled by algorithms and AI systems that say they know what they want better than they do. Your relationship with Storm is something that technology can't program, make, or copy." Danny looked at Storm and felt very thankful for the horse who had taught him to trust his gut feelings instead of just his logical mind. Thomas Hayes had taught Storm how to spot technological threats, but the bond between horse and rider had grown into something more than just training. They had learned to talk to each other through small signs and shared experiences, forming a partnership that was both old and perfect for the problems of today. Danny finally understood what their experience meant for people who were going through similar things in their own lives. The real message isn't about horses or police work or even stopping bad guys, he said. It's about learning to trust the warning signs that our instincts give us, even when they go against what technology, social media, or common sense tell us to believe. Storm nudged Danny's shoulder with his nose, which had become their way of saying they agreed and understood each other. They had shown that some kinds of awareness couldn't be turned into digital or automated forms and that real partnership needed the kind of trust and attention that only came from working together and respecting each other. Danny realized that their story was just beginning as the evening settled over London, and the stable around them grew quiet. Thomas Hayes had come up with some great ideas, and he and Storm had worked together to make them happen. They had also learned that trusting your gut over an algorithm was better than trusting your gut. They would need to share these ideas with others who were having trouble finding their way through a digital world that was becoming more complicated and deceptive. In the future, people would need to be able to tell the difference between real human connection and fake manipulation, as well as between real intuition and fake emotion. Danny and Storm had shown that it was possible to tell the difference, but it would take a lot of courage and dedication to trust something deeper than what technology could offer. 3 months after the events at Trooping the Colour, Danny Morrison stood in front of a packed auditorium at the Metropolitan Police Academy. Hundreds of young officers had come to hear about the partnership that had stopped what historians were already calling the digital coup that never was. The story of how a police constable and his horse have stopped Marcus Webb's psychological warfare campaign had become legendary in law enforcement circles, but Danny knew that the real lessons went much deeper than any official report could show. Danny started, "When people ask me how Storm and I knew what to do that day," his voice full of the confidence that came from months of thinking about their amazing experience, "I tell them that we didn't know anything at all. What we had was something much more valuable than knowledge. We had trust." The audience was paying attention in a way that speakers dream about, but Danny's mind wandered to Storm, who was now enjoying a well-deserved retirement in the countryside. He had gotten a minor injury that had given him the perfect excuse to retire and get a pension he had more than earned. The horse taught Danny things about being aware and working together that no training book could ever teach him. These lessons were useful in many areas of life, not just police work. Danny went on, "In our hyper-connected world, we're drowning in information but starving for real communication." Marcus Webb knew this weakness and used it to his advantage. He knew that people who spend their days staring at screens and reading social media feeds that confirm their existing beliefs would lose the ability to recognize real human connection and real warning signals. Danny clicked to the next slide in his presentation, which showed a picture of Storm in his prime, looking alert and beautiful in his ceremonial police gear. The picture made the audience murmur in appreciation, but Danny saw something else in their faces. He saw how hungry people were when they heard a story about a partnership that went beyond the fake relationships that technology makes possible. Thomas Hayes, Storm's first trainer, knew something that we are only starting to understand in the digital age. He knew that the most advanced threats of the 21st century wouldn't necessarily come from traditional weapons or attacks. They would come from psychological manipulation designed to turn our own emotions and social connections against us. The presentation went on to show declassified video from Webb's network that showed the high-tech gear that had been made to cause embarrassing problems during the royal ceremony. But Danny saw that the technical details only kept the audience's attention for a few minutes before their eyes drifted back to the pictures of Storm. It was as if they knew that the real story was about something that couldn't be digitized or programmed. Danny said, "Webb's plan failed not because we had better technology, but because we had something he couldn't account for." His voice grew stronger as he got closer to the main point he had come to Britain to make. "We had a partnership based on real interest, respect for each other, and the ability to trust our gut feelings more than logical reasoning." After the presentation, a young officer came up to Danny and talked to him. The officer's serious look reminded Danny of when he first joined the force. Constable Sarah Chen introduced herself, and the questions she asked showed that she was genuinely concerned, which gave Danny hope for the future of law enforcement. "Sir, how do we get that kind of gut feeling about our own work?" Chen asked. "Most of us don't have horses trained by military experts, so how do we learn to spot the warning signs that matter?" Danny smiled because he remembered asking similar questions when he was just starting out. "The first step is to learn to pay attention to what's going on around you instead of the screen in your pocket. When you're on patrol, how often do you really pay attention to the people you're supposed to be protecting? Not just looking for obvious criminal behavior, but also noticing the small signs that someone might be in trouble or planning something bad." Chen nodded thoughtfully, but Danny could tell that she was still looking for more specific advice. He knew how she felt. It wasn't possible to break down the skills Storm had shown into simple steps or lists. Danny said, "Start with the people in your own life. Your family, friends, and co-workers. Practice really listening to them instead of just waiting for your turn to talk. Pay attention to when they act differently, like when their voice or body language changes to show they're worried, excited, or hiding something important. The same awareness that helps you tell when your partner is having a bad day will help you tell when someone on your beat is planning to cause trouble." Danny went back to his small Birmingham apartment that night. The walls were covered with pictures and newspaper clippings that showed his relationship with Storm. But the picture that caught his eye was a framed letter from Thomas Hayes's widow thanking Danny for making sure that her husband's new training methods would be remembered and used again. The letter said, "Thomas would be so proud of what you and Storm did. He always thought that the future of security work would depend on partnerships that combined human intelligence with animal instincts and technology. You proved him right." Danny made himself a cup of tea, and sat down in his favorite chair. He thought about the hundreds of people who had come to see his presentation that day and the thousands more who would hear about it through news and social media. The point he was trying to make went way beyond police methods or even the specific threat that Webb's network posed. When AI was being sold as the answer to all human problems, when social media algorithms said they knew what people wanted better than they did, and when digital manipulation could make fiction seem more real than fact, the relationship between Danny and Storm was something that technology couldn't automate or copy. "It's about attention," Danny said out loud to his empty apartment, as he thought through the ideas that would make up his next presentation. "Real attention is when you care about someone or something more than yourself." Storm didn't see Webb's network because he was programmed to look for electronic devices. He saw it because he cared enough about keeping people safe to notice things that everyone else missed. Danny learned a deeper truth from working with Storm: real security, whether for individuals or society as a whole, could never be achieved through surveillance systems or predictive algorithms alone. It took groups of people who cared about each other, listened to their gut feelings when something seemed off, and had the guts to act on their worries even when it was hard or unpopular. Danny's phone buzzed with a text message from Chief Inspector Mitchell, who had been promoted to Scotland Yard after they stopped Webb's psychological attack. The message had a picture of a young police officer working with a German shepherd that had been trained using methods that were similar to those used by Thomas Hayes. Mitchell's message said, "The program is growing. 6 more police forces have asked for training in how to work with animals to find electronic threats." Storm's legacy will live on. Danny knew that the real legacy was more than just police work. Thomas Hayes taught his students important lessons that they would pass on to others. For example, every person who heard their story and decided to trust their gut about a suspicious situation, every parent who put down their phone long enough to really listen to their kids, and every community member who paid attention to their neighbors and did something when something seemed wrong was following his advice. There would be new threats, new ways to manipulate digital information, and new attempts to take advantage of the weaknesses of hyperconnected societies in the future. But it would also bring people who knew that even the most advanced security system couldn't compare to real human care and attention. People who knew that the best information didn't always come from computers but from the old wisdom of really listening to the world around them and trusting the warning signs that came from partnerships based on respect and a common goal. Danny looked out his window at the lights of Birmingham stretching toward the horizon as he got ready for bed that night. He thought about all the people in those buildings who were having trouble telling the difference between real communication and digital deception. He would keep giving presentations and having conversations about what he and Storm had learned the next day, hoping that the message would reach the people who needed to hear it the most. The partnership between a young police officer and an amazing horse had saved the British monarchy from embarrassment, but more importantly, it had shown that some kinds of intelligence couldn't be programmed or automated. That was a truth worth protecting and sharing with anyone who was smart enough to listen in a world where fake relationships and fake feelings are becoming more common.